Hello and welcome to the Lanescape Livestream, an ongoing series where we spend our lunch hour taking a shallow dive into everything related to laneway housing. Today I'll be joined by architect Daniel Hall from the Architect Builders Collaborative. Daniel's firm focuses on superlative, healthy, green design, but their focus on sustainability goes beyond the building envelope. He's also an advocate and educator. Today we're going to discuss sustainability, prefabricated construction, and the social impacts of the Changing Lanes policy. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. The next Lanescape online workshop will be next week on Wednesday, the 24th. There's a link to register for that on our website. As long as COVID's happening, those workshops are going to be provided for free online, so there's no cost, and we'll take as many people sign up. Also, be sure to join us for next week's Lanescape Livestream, which will be on Thursday. Next week, I'll be joined by Dave Leblanc, the architecture writer for the Globe and Mail. Dave's been writing about laneway housing for many years, including ones I've done before the Changing Lanes policy was enacted. And we're going to hear his stories about the people who live on laneways and how they design their homes. Finally, be sure to subscribe to Lanescape's newsletter and follow us on social media so you can have access to all of our policy work and ways you can get involved in advocating for laneway housing and see upcoming events that you can join in on. I'm still waiting for Daniel to log in here, so in the meantime, we'll just talk a little bit about some progress we're seeing from the city. Lanescape is still advocating for lots of things related to the Changing Lanes policy. The most recent issue we've been finding are a few gray zones in the policy, which we'll be releasing a blog post on later this week. Anyone out there who's designing, there's Daniel right now. Anyone out there who's designing laneway houses might be coming across some issues with interpretations of the zoning bylaws and getting their houses approved. So be sure to follow our blogs to see what you can do about locating your dormer in a way the city will find acceptable, and other ways we're finding we need to provide interpretation to the city on how our designs meet the bylaws. So I'm going to bring in Daniel and we'll see what he has to say. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Craig.
How are you?
Hey, how are you?
I didn't recognize your personal Instagram account. I apologize for that.
I didn't realize it was defaulting to that, so.
Well, you're about to get a lot of personal followers. So just so we can cut that off in advance, where can we follow your firm?
TABC Toronto.
Okay.
T as in Toronto, ABC like the alphabet at Toronto.
Good. Well, I see we have a question on here about garden suites. We're going to dive into the policy kind of later in our discussion. So let's hang on to that. And let's start just by talking a little bit about your firm. Give us the Coles notes on what type of projects you do, both laneway and otherwise.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Well, the Architect Builders Collaborative has been around for about 10 years, and our core focus is on green design in a pretty expansive definition of that. And laneways have been an area of particular interest and focus recently in the past couple of years, particularly for the impact they can have on decent housing and affordable housing. And as we can talk about later today, how they can be really green housing as well. We do a range of work. We do a lot of residential renovations and new builds, and we work in the nonprofit sector. We're working on an emergency family shelter for the Red Door shelter at the moment, and a new house in Erin, and a conversion of an 1863 church in Elora. So pretty wide range, and the common thread is a core value of green design that our clients share with us.
Great. Yeah, we've actually been quote unquote competitors for a long time. A lot of the things you do is very near and dear to my heart as well. But I'm sure you'll agree, it's been really fascinating, especially with laneway houses, how collaborative and supportive all of our fellow professionals have been, where I think you said before when you came to one of our workshops, you don't want to mow my grass, but there's more grass than we can mow right now. So it's kind of great that we can actually work with the people who are normally our competitors to try to just build up the community around laneway housing and really help each other kind of get a grasp of this new policy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's things we can do in the green design world altogether. I have frequently, if clients are interested in checking out more than one architect to see who there's a good fit with. I've referred them to you. I've referred them to other colleagues, folks like Solaris, because we need to work together. People want to work with good, skilled designers, and there's lots of work to go around. What you want is a good fit. It's not that we are best of friends always with our clients at the end, but you want to get along with each other. You want to enjoy each other's company. It's a journey designing a home. So,
well, speak for yourself. I've become best friends with every single client I've ever had, so must be something wrong with you.
Apparently so.
So
Time through with us, they've had enough.
Let's start to talk a little bit about sustainable design, because obviously sustainability is a very loaded word. So talk to me a little bit about what you consider to be sustainable design and your approach to green design in your office.
You're right, it is a loaded word. I mean, I love this story. William McDonough, one of the authors of the Cradle to Cradle Manifesto, likes to say is that he hates the word sustainable. And he said, if I asked you, Craig, to characterize your marriage in one word and you said it was sustainable, I'd feel really sorry for you. So we can do a lot better. I haven't found a better word. I mean, green is vague. We toss the word around all the time. It can mean so many things to different people. But we have to find something that engages people to say, we want more of this. If the argument is that everything we do is bad for the environment and we should do less, consume less, use less energy, live in smaller places, all of which I think are great things. But if that's the messaging, there's a point where if you take that to its absurd conclusion, it means we should stop living in buildings and stop making buildings. So we're never going to get beyond the really keen, committed early adopters and make a real impact in the world if that's the focus. Green design has to be something wow. It has to be that moment, when you open the front door of your house and you go, it feels so good to be home. And what is that? Is that the quality of the light, the freshness of the air? I mean, it's certainly not a new car smell, so it's not off-gassing materials and toxic things. But it may be the realm of where, what we do as architects, it's about the feel of a space. It's the proportion of it. And I think at that point, people say, yeah, I want more of this. That to me is the key to making design and buildings truly sustainable.
That's an interesting point. One of the reasons I infuse quote unquote sustainability into my own personal projects and the work I do for clients kind of has nothing to do with saving energy. For me, it's about comfort and having that really sound design in your home, and also the economical benefits of just having low energy bills and a highly durable structure that's going to require less maintenance.
Yeah, absolutely. And comfort, I think, is where we want to start with it. Healthy homes, and then we take it out. It's kind of the peeling back or peeling out the skins of the onion. I think it was Marshall McLuhan who probably said that fashion is our second skin. And then Juhani Plasma sort of riffed on that and said, well, if that's true, then architecture is our third skin and our buildings. So I like to think of it that way. We start here sort of naked and then add our clothing and then add our homes. And at each level, it's how does it make me feel? And then as we build out, how does the envelope performing of the building? We focus a lot on that. But then what about the impact of our decisions? We can make a passive house level, low energy house. But if we do it by slathering 12 inches of styrofoam all around the building, then the making of that styrofoam has made such a debt on the climate, such a contribution to global warming, that house may never pay back its carbon debt to the environment, even if you can heat it with a proverbial blow dryer every winter. So we have to start thinking about the impact of all of those decisions. The other extreme, the beautiful, perfectly crafted straw bale home makes a lot of sense if you've got straw nearby, but on a Toronto laneway where you may be working with a 20-foot wide lot, I don't think too many of us are going to give up 18 inches for those straw bale walls. So, where do we find the medium in that? And it's constantly evolving. I have things in my own house I would never put in again. I have to say, I confess I have spray foam in my crawl space. Never again. We don't spec it in our homes for other people, but it's there, and I'm never gonna rip it out. We're gonna keep it and benefit from it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's an area constantly more levels you can take it to, more nuanced. And we're finding new materials, some technologies coming on board, but one of my favorite new materials you might have come across is the Sonoclimat Eco 4 panel made by MSL Fibre in Quebec. So it's a structural sheathing, it replaces plywood, OSB, and insulation. 1.5 inch thick, structurally sound, our value of 4. We spec'd that on a job recently, and the builder told me when he reworked his numbers, instead of using OSB and rock wool insulation, he was saving the client $3,000 by using this material. So that's green design. Why wouldn't you do it? Except you can't buy it at Home Depot.
Exactly. Well, and that's one of the reasons I'm so obsessed with laneway housing, is that typologically, even if you do nothing, like build to code minimum standards, the typology of that housing is doing a lot to advance our buildings from a sustainability perspective, ecologically, economically, and societally. Just creating that type of housing is giving us a step forward. So how does your design process for a custom home get altered to a laneway home? Do you have to try not as hard because that's already embedded in the typology itself?
That's a good question. We've been focusing a lot on some ready-to-build versions of laneway houses because the typology is quite constrained, and we're finding, as I love it as you put it, one of your seminars, are you here for love or for money? And although many people express an interest at our seminars and webinars that they're there for the investment potential, in fact, on our client base, it skews the other way, and 3/4 of our clients are doing it for family, for love reasons. And so that tends to be a more custom design process. It's what is it that you specifically want? A home for 2 writers is an interior focused space, features bookcases prominently. That's very different than a home for people who are very active about getting outside and wanting to be out, cycling and taking their kayaks and that every day. But when it's an income property, now we're getting into that world where you're designing for that unknown, for the sort of mainstream market. So we're fitting in with spaces that just flow and work well with open concept designs. And as I'm sure you've run into as well, if you have a 20 or 22 foot wide lot by 32 foot 9, there's only so many ways you can fit things in it. So the designs tend to fall into a few standard typologies. But Toronto has had this all the time. If you walk into a 1920s Toronto home, there's probably 5 different versions of them out there. You can walk up to the front door, you can look at the width, which side the door is on, and you know where the bathroom is in the house. You don't even have to walk in the door. So this is nothing new. And within that, you can still do a lot of great different design variations.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and another fun thing about lot sizes in Toronto is with the main house, it's almost impossible to meet the passive house standard in most cases because you've got such a narrow north-south building orientation. You just can't get the solar heat gain compared to the depth of the floor plate. Whereas with a laneway house, you're more of a square or possibly a shallow rectangle where the majority of your floor plate gets natural light and passive solar heating. Have you attempted to design a passive house level laneway house before, or do you have one in the works?
Not yet. We are working with some collaborators on encouraging them to go for a model passive house modular build, which we can talk about later, just to prove that it can be done. I'm still, as I alluded to before in terms of the materials, the passive house I find is a great aspirational goal. I'm skeptical in some situations of its value if you are piling on uneconomic levels of insulation to achieve a particular benchmark. Right. I think we're really interested in that value proposition, both the embodied carbon value, it's a huge one, and the financial value. So we did a deep green retrofit of a home a few years ago, thinking we put lots of insulation on the outside of an old brick building. We ended up modeling it and settling on only 3 inches on the south face because we wanted the solar heat gain coming in. And 3 inches of mineral wool insulation is not very much on a house. I mean, it doesn't meet code, except it's a retrofit, so it didn't matter. But that was basically R12 of insulation on those walls. But that's where the energy model played out as a sweet spot. Doubling that insulation did not pay for itself in energy consumption. So it's, as you know, the deeper you dive in to green, the murkier the pool gets. The bottom of which is the greener solution. And as I say, we keep expanding our definition. We're very interested in the social impact, the social sustainability of what we're doing, and on making sure that it is really affordable so that people can and will do it.
Well, one of
the Laneway. Go ahead.
One of the mechanisms you're using to try to accomplish those ends is prefabrication. So talk to us a little bit about what you're finding in designing prefab laneway homes and how you're able to accomplish your sustainability goals either easier or cheaper than stick framing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an area of interest of mine for about 15 years. I had a company, Sustain Design Studio, quite a few years back, and we prototyped an off-grid portable eco-friendly home. So essentially an RV that was good year-round, solar powered. It was 8.5 feet wide. So laneway homes are really spacious in comparison. It's 36 feet by 8.5. We could put 2 of those on a laneway and stack them double high, put 4 of those on a property. But that was my first real foray into prefabrication, and we used both prefabricated panel systems and fully modularized in a factory. And I think there's a lot of confusion about that. As John Straub would point out, we have prefabrication in every building we're building. Take a look at your window or your door units. Those are prefabricated. Historically, a window was built out of glass and bits of wood by the carpenter on site. Now we have this very complicated, very important piece of technology coming from a factory, and we insert it in a wall. So that's prefabrication. I mean, the next step up is really prefabricating entire wall panels, and I know a number of companies are doing a lot of interesting work on that front, including passive house level wall assemblies. So you can start to look at passive house level construction without the builder necessarily having years of experience in doing passive house building. So I think that's really interesting. You sub out your wall assembly. That takes care of 90% of your passive house problems. We're seeing ones where people like Fourth Pig are doing them with straw bale prefabricated wall assemblies. So, that's a really interesting idea. And then you take it to the next degree and you get into, I guess, what we refer to in the industry as modularized construction. Again, I wish there was a better term for it. It really means factory built, but it's where you're building almost the entire house in the factory. And the modular part means it's coming down the highway in boxes that are small enough to fit under a highway bridge and on a truck. Practically speaking, that means 16 feet wide up to about 60 feet long. And if you want to spend the money on the roundabout route, you can go 12 feet high, but 11 feet high works better. So what's interesting with those is they tend to be long and rectangular. They don't have to be. I mean, you can change the shape, but they default that way for economics. And that lends itself really interesting to the laneway typology, which are these long rectangles, particularly usually with 2 blindside walls because we're close to the lot line. And so in fact, we're looking at a project now we're working on where the building will only be 16 feet wide. It's a 16'8" lot. So we can make it one single module out of the factory per floor, stack the 2 up like 2 blocks of Lego on site. When it comes out of the factory, the tiles on the wall, the outlets are in, the lights are installed. We put it together, you basically do what they call stitching. You seal the joint and connect it to the services. You have to have all the site work, all of the problems with laneway houses of servicing off the main house, trenching up your backyard, fitting your foundations in beside your neighbor's garage. All of those are the same. But when you put it on top, the crane can come and in a day it's gone and your house is 95% finished. And to me, that has a lot of potential with reducing the traffic and congestion in the laneway, with tackling a lot of the logistical problems that I know builders who are focusing on laneway construction have to get really, really good. How do you work on a tight site? How do you stage your materials? So, you provide a solution to those. In terms of the green building part of your question, it's really that a lot of the things like the material, that panel I mentioned earlier, they're hard to get here. There's one supplier in the GTA who can bring it in for you. But if you're building it in a factory, you can get a lift straight from the manufacturer in your factory, and the materials are ready when you need it. If you need the specialty sealant tape, so, I know like some of the specialty green builders will basically carry their own inventories and warehouse of the tapes and sealants that they need. Because again, you can't run out to Home Depot and get them. It's a supply chain problem. In the factory, you have all of that there. The quality control is amazing. Detail, I was in the factory in the Laurentians recently, and they were, lifting up these fully assembled wall panels built on the floor like you'd often build them, and you typically, the carpenter, and I used to be one for 15 years, you struggle and you stand these walls up, and so you don't really want to pre-build everything in them because they get too heavy. In the factory, they put 2 hooks on the lifting points and they lift them up with the gantry crane, swing them into place, and you can take your coffee break while the wall's hanging there, and then move it over a 1/4 inch and nudge it in. Double layers of sealant under the sill plate, overlapping house wrap, tape on the inside, and I've seen 4 layers of redundant air sealing at what's typically the sloppiest, weakest joint in the house. So those are the things we're seeing. It's not revolutionary, but it's an incredibly efficient way to build. And you're not finding weather problems. You're not finding your tools missing on Monday morning because you didn't put them away Friday night. They're on your workbench where you left them. So what I heard from a factory owner who was opening a new facility recently in Quebec, he had 7,000 applications, people applying to work in the factory there. It's a lot of tradespeople, when they get to be my age, are looking like, I don't want to keep slogging away on the job site in cold weather through the winter. I could go to work in a nice, clean, dry environment and have a regular, 8 to 4 shift. That's pretty appealing in a lot of trades work. So I think it's multiple layers, and it really comes down to allowing people to do really good quality work and do it consistently.
Well, it makes sense that the things you control result in a higher quality product. And that makes sense because you can control the factory and even to some degree transportation. But what happens when you get to site? We had a question in the chat. Are you craning modules or panels over the house, or are you able to fit them down laneways?
That entirely depends on the site. So a project we're looking at right now, the crane operator went and took a look at the situation, and he gave me 2 choices. He said, we can bring in, our preferred size, the larger modules, so fewer modules. He said, we can bring them in from the street, 140 feet lift to the backyard, up and over a 3-story house. The crane takes 4 support vehicles to carry the counterweights for it. It's a 400-ton crane. He said, or if we make the modules smaller and we can get them up the laneway, which was only 11 feet wide at its pinch point. So he said, keep all your units 10 feet or under. Then the crane is what they call a 70-ton crane. It sets up on its own with its outriggers. It's, of course, half the price of renting the crane, but we don't have 5 or 6 hours of setting up the counterweights. We're not blocking the street for as long. It's an easier lift, but we're using smaller module widths. So it becomes a design question. Does our design still work? Can you make a design that works comfortably with those divisions? Fortunately, with the technology of modular building, you can have openings of 20 feet long in the wall between modules. So you put 2 of those together, you don't know you're passing from one module to the next in the finished house. The flooring's continuous, the walls are continuous, the trim's continuous. You really can't tell where the module is. So from an architect's perspective, you can modularize pretty much anything we can design. Certainly, I would say within the constraint of what a laneway house can be. There's lots of other house designs where modular may not suit.
So I have my own presuppositions on the answer to this question, but I'm interested in your take. It sounds perfect. Why isn't everybody doing it?
That's a good question. It's not perfect for every site. So there are definitely logistic issues. Another project we're working on has a 150-year-old oak tree growing against an existing garage. Now we've cutting back the garage to make an L shape, and we're building a 2nd story on top of it. So basically we're wrapping around the tree. In that close proximity to the tree and its branches that are there, you couldn't get the crane and the boom in and the modules in. It just doesn't make sense. So that's one clearly you're going to site build. The more custom the situation on site is, it's the shape and size of the building isn't the issue. It's being able to lift it in. That's probably the main reason why you would or wouldn't do it. I took a look for a potential client yesterday, just even looking with them on Google at their situation. Power lines in the lane that are serving the adjacent commercial properties. Well, we're not going to be able to take those down without inconveniencing people to a point you won't want to do it. So there was no room to swing the back end of the crane around there. Now, there may be a way to slide a modular in off of a couple of forklifts, but the craning and lifting it in there wouldn't be an option. So the starting point for that is really getting the crane company to come and scout the location, and they will tell you pretty quickly if they can do it or not.
Yeah, I view that as one of the biggest impediments is that you need a really good brain to proceed any work. So hiring someone like yourself, and that makes it potentially not feasible economically because every project is going to be different, and prefab really starts to pay dividends when you're building the same module in a high volume. So, do you still think?
I think that's a common misunderstanding, Craig. Prefab is not building the same thing. We've really shifted. 15 years ago, that would have been the case. We've really transitioned into the world of mass customization now. So, we draw, as I'm sure you do, we draw with BIM software. Those drawings go to the factory as fabrication drawings. So we have to understand a few things like wall assemblies, but you probably don't invent a new wall assembly for every project you work on.
Right.
Like most architects, you probably have a few go-to assembly types. You're rearranging them, you're changing the space, you're playing with the spatial forms. That's entirely possible. The materials we can spec any tile we want, whether it's CIOT or stone tile or wherever we're supplying from. They can supply the tile in the quantity we need to the factory to be installed. So it isn't that we have to pick from the three things they have in the factory. There is that form, that is a more traditional form of, I guess, the double wide trailer park house. Pick A, B, or C from your finished palette. But the world of modular building has become much more customizable. They basically will build pretty much anything you can throw at them.
Right. The economic side of it, though, you're still resulting in a house that's at market construction rates or higher. Or are you able to build for a lower cost than stick framing?
So we're finding we're still at the budget pricing stage. Our first two projects with the modular we expect will be built this fall. So ask me again in October what the final real price was. What we're seeing at the costing level are finished landed price, everything installed, including site services, hovering around $300 a square foot. And we're finding similar costs from our stick builders. And I'm not sure there's any huge discount to be had in the modular world. I think what you can get is an uptick in performance. So for example, our standard assembly with this one manufacturer is an R40 wall versus a code R27, but we're building them for the same price. We're doing an R60 roof insulation. Again, this is no foam. This is all cellulose insulation instead of the code minimum R31. So we're almost doubling the performance of the roof at a similar finished price. And I think that's, to me, what I said about making green design affordable. It's not affordable in the sense I would like it to be, that we're down at $150 a square foot fully finished and we can make very cheap buildings. It's affordable in that it's costing you no more than it costs to build conventionally. And yet we can take the green performance up a notch.
Yeah, but you get more for your money, so the value is greater than traditional construction.
And particularly things like, I don't know if you've tried to specify dense pack cellulose wall in Toronto, but it's hard to find anyone who actually will build it. The technology is mature and been around a long time. It's just difficult to get it done. You're a limited pool of subtrades who will do it. Mm-hmm. So if it's the factory is set up to do that, then they can do it over and over again every project you want. So that's kind of where the economy of scale comes in, is that they can use the more advanced materials and techniques that we would like them to be using on every project because it becomes standard for them.
Yeah, like I said, the brain that precedes the work dictates the work, right? So having the ability to hire someone like yourself who knows the trades, who can execute this kind of design, are really critical to realizing that value creation. I'm seeing a lot of confidence.
Yeah, I would say it is definitely in the planning, but to be perfectly clear, we can get all of this built for you and your clients and any architect's clients. The builders are not tied into working with any one of us. They are willing to work for whoever wants to bring them the project. And, I'm not interested in tying people down to that kind of relationship either. I think the whole point of this is, as we said at the beginning, there's enough of this to go around, and I don't see why every laneway house wouldn't be net zero and carbon zero ultimately.
That's a great point. No one should hire you. Just come to Lanescape. Forget about Daniel, everybody.
You got it. You got it, Craig.
No, but seriously, you're very uniquely skilled, which is why we're having this discussion. So don't sell yourself too short there. I'm seeing a lot of comments about how we should have a full webinar on just craning and prefabrication and how that affects building. So maybe we'll regroup on this in a little bit and continue the discussion.
Good.
One thing I want to move on to, though, because I really appreciate your opinions on it, is the policy itself. So we've talked about how you execute a home, but that home obviously has to fit within this new zoning policy that's been created to allow laneway housing.
Yeah.
What's your experience been so far? You've existed as an architect in the pre-changing lanes policy world, and now you've seen this new as of right policy get created. How has your workflow changed? How has your client base changed? Like, what are you seeing open up in this part of the industry?
Oddly enough, I think we're probably doing more projects at Committee of Adjustment now than before.
What's the
It's that it's maybe we just get the quirky projects thrown our way. I don't know, but we're getting the people who say, I want a laneway house, but I don't have a public lane. So what's that? You know, it's a right of way, it's a private lane. It looks and feels like a lane. So, you know, we can take that to committee and see. We haven't taken any through yet, but we get a number of inquiries like that. I think as you're probably running into, a lot of people are bumping up against the 85% soft landscaping rule and saying, I don't want to tear down my deck that I built 4 years ago, or I like to have an outdoor room in my backyard. And so why can't I put a green roof on the laneway suite and use that as my soft landscaping? So I think we're seeing a number of cases. We're seeing people wanting to build on the footprint where they were, where their building was, so closer to the lane than was allowed. So I'm not sure I've really seen what the desired outcome was, that the as of right solution opens up and makes it a lot easier. I think it's just kind of, I guess, maybe like when we put seatbelts in cars, people just drive faster. We just push our boundaries further now.
My response to those people are, if you don't want to build a second home on your property with no development charges, then that's fine. You don't need to plant a little bit more grass. You can just not build it. Like those kinds of impediments I find are just people being stubborn, not necessarily an issue with the policy itself. But you've got, I mean, I think the important point you touched on there was that it only really affects a small portion of Torontonians. And it's not the kind of golden ticket to homeowners unlocking value in their property like we were maybe expecting it to be. So what is working and what's not with it that we can learn from and either adapt this policy or grow into new policy?
Well, I think the key area, and I know you touched on this at your last one as well, is the firefighting access, in particular, the intransigence around 1 meter between houses. When we have historic zoning in the former city of Toronto and East York of traditionally 18 inches and 36-inch separations between houses, you know, 18 plus 18 equaling 36. So if that 36-inch was acceptable, it would unlock a lot more properties that are currently basically landlocked because of the fire constraint. And this is not a zoning. This is not coming out of the zoning bylaw. But Toronto Fire has turned out to be an incredibly important player in this. So I would like to see that reduced, because in all my discussions with them, no one can actually tell me why it's 1 meter. There doesn't appear to be any code or research base around that. In fact, we know that firefighters routinely walk through doorways into houses that are less than 1 meter wide. Code allows it. The hallways in any Part 9 building, any residential building, those non-building code types I hear, are all less than 1 meter. Typically 30 inches to 34-inch stairs are required. So firefighters with all their gear can rescue people out of burning houses, traveling through a 34-inch wide corridor, but somehow they can't walk between two houses when they have 36 or 37 or 38 inches. I don't get it. And I think it's like a non-tariff barrier to trade, right? It's a non-code and a non-zoning barrier to implementing public policy. And I really feel that the councillors should talk to the fire department at the highest levels and say, we want you to get on board and cooperate with making this work and keep people safe. Absolutely. No one wants to have someone die of smoke inhalation or fire because the firefighters couldn't get to them. But I honestly don't see where the rigidity around that is. And we have a process where Toronto Fire will, for a fee, about $460, they'll review your fire access route if you're an apartment owner with an apartment building. We've asked them if we could use the same review process so we could get our fire routes reviewed before people spend a lot of time and money hiring us to design a building and apply. And they went up the chain of command and came back and said, no, we can't do that. And again, I've questioned why. And so this is a question, I think, at the policy level for council to simply say, we would like you to implement a fee for service review so that people know early on whether they're likely to get approved or not, and not spend $10 or $15 or $20,000 to get to know.
Yeah.
So I think it's about access and making it easy for people.
Yeah, you've touched on, I think, probably the hottest issue with laneway housing right now with this emergency access issue. I'm personally in favor of like the statistics around it, which, I mean, respectful disagreements occur all over the place. But where I think you really made a point that I am absolutely in agreement with is that policy was not codified in a way that was clear at the outset, and certainly not in a way that we as design professionals can give our clients certainty. And that's really flying against the whole democratic approach to laneway housing. Like, we created this beautiful housing policy that gives people fast, cost-efficient, reliable housing entitlements. But then, of course, there's this random thing layered on top of it that's almost eliminating all of those good principles. So do you have a vision on what we do about that? Or is that just something the city's going to have to keep evolving on its own as we consider new housing typologies separately?
Well, I think more transparency on it is clear. We're seeing that at every level of how our governments work. So this memorandum of understanding that the Toronto Fire, even the discussions that presumably we are having in the back rooms now, why aren't those brought out into the public light? Why is it that someone has to apply through access of information to get a copy of the previous memorandum of understanding that was used to implement the building code in Ontario, even when it's brought by one of their own fire staff to a public building code commission ruling, as you were there, as I was, and they would not release a copy of it afterwards?
Yeah.
Why do we have to jump through these hoops to get information that our public servants are using to do their job properly on our behalf? It shouldn't be a secret. And so I think that's a simple level. I'm not saying it's a political decision on how much fire access you need, but I think there needs to be clarity on where the decisions are being made and why. Where's the science behind it? Where's the evidence that this is based on? And I think that applies all the way through, the housing policy.
Yeah, I agree with that. We should make this, especially the emergency access policy, something that's codified in writing. That way we can start debating it, rather than something that's arbitrarily created behind closed doors that we don't even know what it is, let alone have the ability to influence it. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, exactly.
So one other thing we've talked about in the past is how development charges related to laneway suites. The conservative capitalist in me loves it, but I also agree with your point that you think it should be contingent on meeting certain standards that kind of benefit our city as a whole before you get that economic boon of not having to pay development charges. Talk to me a little bit about your thought behind the fact that laneway houses are development charge free and how that's affecting Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is done already, although when we revisit it with garden suites, there may be an opportunity to approach it differently. I don't think council's going to be able to rescind their indefinite deferral of the laneway, of the development charges at this point.
And not with the existing ones, but maybe with future ones.
No,
they love to walk truck
but
back,
I do,
right?
I do question because the same people who are, benefiting from no development charges also will routinely ask, well, why can't I have servicing up the laneway? Why can't our sewers be in the laneway? Why can't we get this access? I say, well, it's infrastructure. We need to build this stuff. And the city, as we all know, desperately needs money for rec centers, for fire departments. If we want laneway-sized fire trucks, who's going to pay for those? I mean, the city owns a couple already, but they don't deploy them where the laneways are. They deploy them on the Toronto Island. That's where they have small roads. So if we want all these things, we have to pay for them. And development charges are the tax that pays for infrastructure and capital. It doesn't pay for operating expenses of the city. So we're taking out this huge revenue stream at a time when the city is absolutely desperate for money for all forms of infrastructure. So as a public policy decision, I question why and who benefits. Well, the people who benefit are people who already own all these homes. So it very much becomes a socioeconomic issue, that the people who are benefiting from this are generally people like you and me who own homes, who are generally well off compared to a lot of people in the city. So there's a sort of an equity lens to put on it. And I'd say, is that where the city should be giving tax breaks to? And I think if people were aware that that's what they were giving, was a $70,000 tax break to every homeowner who has a laneway property who chooses to develop it, it's questionable. The public policy stated that one of the reasons we were developing the changing lanes policy was to give affordable housing. And yet I don't see that happening, and I don't see the mechanisms in the policy to make it happen. To my mind, when you're talking about economics like affordability, development charge is an obvious mechanism. Trade the $70,000 or $80,000 development charge gift in return for some commitment to some measure of affordability. To me, that's straight math.
Yeah, not just affordability, perhaps a green standard or something in that vein. So let's envision we continue advocating for something like garden suites. How would you imagine tying a development charge relief to something? Like, what are the key principles we would want to enforce in that relief?
Well, I'm not a planner in the sense of understanding how you can make the policy really implement well. I would say there'd be two broad things. You get some form of relief in return for a defined measure of sustainability. So perhaps it's a net zero target, although by 2030 that will be code minimum, we're told. So by the time we have garden suites, that may not be a step forward. Maybe a zero carbon standard. Maybe it's a higher tier of the Toronto Green Standard. So tie it to something that the city already can measure and say, you have to meet that standard above just code. Or tie it, as we're doing with their affordable housing, the pilot project of the $50,000 forgivable loan. That's tied to a level of rent reduction. I personally think it's an unrealistic measure they're using. If we had a more realistic definition of affordable rent in Toronto, more people might be prepared to go there. So you might say, great, you get relief of the $80,000 in return for your one-bedroom apartment renting at 80% of the prevailing true market rent or something like that.
Right.
These models have been used. A developer I know developed 60 apartments in the city of London, Ontario, about 15 years ago with exactly this model. The city stepped up and gave them financing up front in return for a commitment to keep their rent at 3/4 of market rent for 20 years. In return, he became an advocate for green building when I talked with him, because he was looking at saying 20 years from now, I can charge more for my rent. So I want a building that looks really great in 20 years. Well, that was a built-in incentive for a purely profit-driven developer to go green, because he wanted good long-term durable buildings that would be low cost to operate for him. So we can tie the two together there, but the city has very few mechanisms. They don't have cash to give out, but effectively we're giving away cash in that form by not charging the tax.
Interesting. Well, I love the idea of keeping that relief in place in exchange for investing in improving the city of Toronto. So that makes a lot of sense, and I look forward to collaborating with you on our garden suite policy and everything else we'll keep fighting for.
Absolutely. I will be there, Craig. I'm so impressed with the dedication and commitment you've brought over the years to pushing this forward and making the laneway suites possible. And I think everyone who builds one should be aware that there's a little bit of a debt of gratitude to be paid to people like yourselves and Joe Flatt and Evergreen, and did a lot of the heavy lifting over the years. So
well, and likewise to yourself, who this was a team effort from everyone. So it's very heartening to have these conversations with people who would otherwise be competitors, but really just ended up being friends and collaborators at the end of all this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Daniel. It's been an absolute pleasure. And for everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to tune in next week. On Thursday, I'll be speaking with Dave Leblanc from the Globe and Mail about life on laneways. Be sure to follow Lanescape on our social medias and TABC as well. What's your website again, Daniel?
On Instagram, it's at TABC Toronto, and the website is very simply tabc.ca.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining.
Great, Craig. Well, thank you for having me, Craig.
Have a good day, everybody. We'll see you on the laneways.